A Roman emperor lies dead on a foreign battlefield. The dust of Persia clings to his armor, and with him the dream of glory fades into silence. Julian, the philosopher, the warrior, the man who sought to revive the old gods, had marched east with a vision as grand as Rome itself. He wanted not just victory, but destiny, to outshine Alexander the Great, to prove that Rome still ruled the world. But now, as his body cools under the desert sun, another man stands in his place. Uncertain, desperate, and trapped. His name is Jovian. Until that moment, few outside the army even knew him. A loyal officer, not a legend. Yet now, every hope of survival rests on his shoulders. Picture it. Tens of thousands of soldiers stranded deep inside enemy territory, their supplies gone, their dream of conquest turned into a fight for life. The Euphrates is far behind, and ahead stretches the heart of Persia, vast, unfamiliar, and filled with unseen watchers. Each night, the Roman camp falls into uneasy silence. You can almost hear the crack of dying fires, the rustle of tired armor, and the whispers of men wondering whether they will ever see home again. Hunger gnaws, fear lingers. For every soldier gazing westward, Rome feels impossibly distant, more memory than promise, and in the quiet, they wait for Jovian, their emperor, their last hope. Across the lines, the Persians hold every advantage. Their king, Shapur II, has waited years for this moment, the chance to turn Roman pride into surrender. And so, as messengers pass between the two camps, the fate of an empire hangs by a thread. Jovian faces a choice no leader ever wants: continue fighting and doom his army to starvation, or kneel and save their lives. To surrender was to stain the honor of Rome, yet to refuse would mean the death of every man under his command. Imagine that burden, standing on the banks of an unknown river, knowing that whichever path you choose, history will judge you. In the end, Jovian signs. The ink dries on what will be remembered not as peace, but as humiliation, the Peace of Nisibis. Cities Rome had ruled for generations are handed over to Persia. Loyal allies like Armenia are left to fend for themselves. For the first time, the great Roman eagle bows before another empire. And yet, within that moment of defeat, there is something deeply human. Jovian's choice was not born of cowardice, but of compassion, for his soldiers, for survival, for the hope that Rome might rise again. It teaches us that sometimes saving lives matters more than saving pride. So the next time you hear of triumphs and conquests, remember this quieter tale, the peace signed in the shadow of loss, where courage took the shape of surrender. Will Rome rise from this disgrace? Join us as we uncover the forgotten turning points that shaped empires and echoes still today. Like, share, and subscribe to Legacy of Empires, where the past's greatest stories come alive once more. And tell us below, in Jovian's place, what would you have done, fought on, or chosen survival? Picture this: the spring of 363, and an emperor stands at the edge of destiny. Julian wasn't your typical Roman ruler. He was a walking contradiction, a puzzle that fascinated and terrified his contemporaries in equal measure. While most emperors of his time had embraced Christianity, Julian did something almost unthinkable. He turned his back on the faith that had swept through the empire and returned to worshiping the old gods of Rome: Zeus, Apollo, Mars. These were his divine patrons. His own people called him the Apostate, the one who abandoned the faith, and he wore that title like a badge of honor. But Julian was more than just a religious rebel. He was a philosopher who quoted Greek texts in his spare time, a dreamer who saw himself as the heir to ancient greatness. And when he looked east toward Persia, he didn't just see an enemy empire. He saw his chance to become the next Alexander the Great. Can you imagine that kind of ambition? To look at one of the most powerful empires in the world and think, I can conquer that? So Julian did what any emperor with dreams of glory would do. He assembled the biggest Roman army anyone had seen in decades. 80,000 soldiers. Just think about that number for a moment. 80,000 men, all marching together, their armor clinking in rhythm, their boots pounding the ancient roads. This wasn't just a raiding party or a border skirmish. This was an invasion force designed to bring an empire to its knees. His plan was brilliant in its boldness. Julian would lead his massive army on a lightning-fast march down the Euphrates River, straight toward Ctesiphon, the gleaming capital of the Sassanian Persian Empire. The strategy relied on speed and surprise, hit them hard and fast before they could fully mobilize their defenses. Meanwhile, a second Roman force, with help from Rome's Armenian allies, would march through Nisibis and sweep down along the Tigris River, creating a two-pronged attack that would trap the Persians between hammer and anvil. But here's where the story gets truly fascinating, where we see the man behind the military strategy. Julian didn't just bring weapons and supplies on this campaign. He brought a book, not a military manual or a map, but a copy of Virgil's Aeneid, the great Roman epic poem about the founding of Rome. He believed this ancient text held omens, secret messages from the gods about his fate. Can you imagine? An emperor, leading 80,000 men into battle, consulting poetry for divine guidance like others might consult their generals. This wasn't madness, it was faith. Julian truly believed the old gods were guiding him, that destiny had chosen him for greatness. When he sat in his tent at night, reading by lamplight about the hero Aeneas and his divine mission to found Rome, Julian saw himself in those verses. He was convinced he was living out his own epic, one that would be remembered for thousands of years. As spring gave way to early summer, the army gathered at Carrhae, a name that should have given any Roman pause, since it was near there that Crassus and his legions had been destroyed by the Parthians centuries before. But Julian was undeterred. Within a month of leaving his headquarters in Antioch, he had his enormous force assembled and ready. The air must have been electric with anticipation, with fear, with that strange mixture of confidence and uncertainty that comes before any great undertaking. The soldiers didn't know it yet, but they were marching toward one of Rome's greatest disasters. Julian's gamble was about to turn into a nightmare, and the Peace of Nisibis that would follow would haunt the Roman Empire for generations. But in that moment, as they set out toward Ctesiphon, with their philosopher emperor at the head, anything seemed possible. The old gods were watching, the omens had been read, and glory beckoned on the horizon like a mirage in the desert heat. The campaign had started with such promise, but by early summer of 363, everything was unraveling. Julian's army had pushed deep into Persian territory, far from any friendly fortress or supply line. They'd won battles, yes, they'd even reached the walls of Ctesiphon itself, but the Persians refused to give them the decisive confrontation Julian craved. Instead, the enemy employed a strategy as old as the desert itself. Scorched earth. They burned their own fields, poisoned wells, and melted away before the Roman advance like sand through fingers. Now Julian faced a commander's worst nightmare. His soldiers were exhausted, hungry, and stranded hundreds of miles inside enemy territory. The Persian summer heat beat down mercilessly, and every day the supply situation grew more desperate. Making matters worse, that second Roman force, the one that was supposed to link up with Julian's army, had never arrived. The emperor was alone, surrounded, and running out of options. So Julian made the hardest decision of his life: retreat. The army that had marched so confidently toward glory would now have to fight its way back home. They burned their own ships on the Tigris River to prevent the Persians from using them, a decision that meant there could be no turning back, no changing course. It was march or perish. The retreat turned into a running battle, with Persian cavalry harassing them at every turn. Day after day, the Romans trudged northward, fighting off attacks, struggling with the heat, watching their supplies dwindle to nothing. The tension must have been unbearable. Every rock could hide an archer, every hill might conceal a Persian war band. Then came that fateful day near Samarra. The details are hazy, lost in the fog of ancient accounts and conflicting testimonies, but what we know is this. In the midst of a chaotic skirmish, Julian made a fatal mistake. Perhaps caught up in the heat of the moment, perhaps trying to inspire his weary troops by personal example, he charged forward, but he'd forgotten to put on his breastplate. His torso was unprotected, vulnerable. A spear came out of nowhere. Some accounts say it was thrown by a Persian cavalryman. Others whisper darker possibilities. The weapon found its mark, piercing Julian's side and striking his liver. The emperor, the philosopher, the dreamer of empires, fell from his horse. They carried him to his tent as the battle raged outside. Imagine that scene. The sounds of combat filtering through the fabric walls, the smell of blood and dust, the emperor lying on a simple camp bed, knowing his time was running out. His physicians did what they could, but wounds to the liver in the 4th century after Christ were essentially a sentence passed. Julian knew he was finished. And here's where history gives us one of its most haunting moments. As Julian lay there, his life flowing out of him, he reportedly spoke his final words. "You have won, Galilean." The Galilean, that's what he called Christ, referencing Jesus' origins in Galilee. But what did Julian mean? Was it a curse? A bitter acknowledgement that the Christian God had defeated him after all? Or was it something deeper? An admission that perhaps he'd been wrong, that his return to the old gods had been a mistake? We'll never truly know what was in Julian's heart in those final moments. The mystery of those words has fascinated historians for over 1,600 years. What we do know is that by nightfall, the emperor was gone. He was only 31 years old. But here's where the story takes an even darker turn, one that most people don't know. Some ancient historians, writing in the decades after Julian's passing, suggested something that would have been almost too scandalous to say openly. What if Julian wasn't killed by a Persian at all? What if someone in his own army had taken that opportunity, in the chaos of battle, to rid Rome of its apostate emperor? Think about it. Julian had made enemies, powerful enemies. The Christian establishment despised him for abandoning their faith and trying to restore pagan worship. There were soldiers in his ranks who saw him not as a visionary, but as a heretic. And in the confusion of a skirmish, with dust and noise and bodies everywhere, who could say for certain where that spear had come from? We'll likely never have definitive proof one way or another. But the very fact that ancient writers considered this possibility tells us something important. Julian was a polarizing figure, loved by some, hated by others, and his sudden demise was convenient for many powerful people back in Rome. With Julian gone, the army faced an impossible situation. They were still deep in Persian territory, still surrounded, still starving. They needed a new leader immediately, and they chose a general named Jovian, a man who was, by all accounts, completely unprepared for the catastrophe he'd just inherited. This moment, this single spear thrust on a dusty battlefield near Samarra, changed everything. It ended Julian's dream of a restored pagan Rome. It doomed his army to a humiliating retreat, and it set in motion the treaty that would come next, one that would shame Rome for generations. Could Rome have turned the tide if Julian had survived? Would the empire's story have been different if that spear had missed its mark? These are the questions that keep historians awake at night, the what-ifs that make history so endlessly fascinating. And now we want to hear from you. What do you think? Was Julian's end fate, bad luck, or something more sinister? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and if you're finding this story as gripping as we do, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Legacy of Empires. We're here to remember history's greatest defeats and the lessons they still teach us today, bringing these ancient stories back to life where they belong, not forgotten in dusty books, but alive in our conversations and our understanding of how empires rise and fall. The worst, though, was yet to come. Jovian's nightmare was just beginning, and Rome was about to sign a treaty that would haunt it for decades. Imagine waking up one morning as a relatively unknown general, and by nightfall, you're the Emperor of Rome, but not the Rome of marble palaces and cheering crowds. No, you're emperor of 80,000 exhausted, starving, terrified soldiers trapped hundreds of miles inside enemy territory, with no clear way home and Persian cavalry circling like wolves around a wounded deer. This was Jovian's reality on that terrible day in June of 363. The legions had to choose someone immediately. You can't have an army without a leader, especially not when you're surrounded by enemies. And so they turned to Jovian, a man whose greatest qualification seems to have been simply being there at the right, or perhaps the wrong moment. He wasn't a brilliant strategist like Julian. He wasn't a hardened veteran with decades of frontier warfare under his belt. He was just a general who suddenly found himself holding the weight of an empire on his shoulders, and that empire was in free fall. Put yourself in Jovian's sandals for a moment. Your predecessor just bled to death from a spear wound. Your army is stranded in the Persian heartland with summer heat beating down like a hammer. Your supply lines were cut weeks ago, and every single day, Persian horsemen appear on the horizon, shooting arrows, testing your defenses, wearing you down bit by bit. What do you do? The situation was deteriorating by the hour. The soldiers were already on reduced rations when Julian died, but now things got truly desperate. Food ran out. Then the pack animals, the mules and horses that carried supplies and equipment, started disappearing into cooking pots. Yes, you read that right. The Roman legions, the most disciplined military force in the ancient world, were reduced to eating their own pack animals just to survive another day. Try to imagine what that must have been like. These weren't just animals. They were tools of war, transportation, companions on the march. Soldiers would have formed bonds with these creatures over months or years of campaigning. But hunger is a powerful force, one that strips away sentiment and leaves only survival. The smell of roasting meat would have filled the camp, a smell that should have been comforting, but instead carried with it the bitter taste of desperation. And still, the Persians kept coming. They didn't need to launch a massive assault. Why risk their own soldiers when time and the desert were doing their work for them? Every day the Romans grew weaker. Every day the march became harder. Every day more men fell behind, unable to continue. Jovian was living through every commander's worst nightmare. He could see his options narrowing, the walls closing in. Fighting his way back to Roman territory might cost thousands of lives, lives he couldn't afford to lose. His men were already dropping from exhaustion and starvation. How many would survive a running battle lasting weeks? But surrender? Negotiating with the enemy? That was almost unthinkable for a Roman emperor. Rome didn't ask for terms. It dictated them. Roman pride, Roman honor, the entire mystique of Roman invincibility rested on the idea that Rome never backed down, never admitted defeat. Yet here was Jovian, staring at reality with clear eyes. His men were starving. They'd already eaten the pack animals that carried their gear. They'd already burned their ships on the Tigris River weeks earlier, a decision made during the retreat that now seemed prophetic. Those ships were gone, turned to ash and smoke, eliminating any possibility of river transport or escape. Every bridge behind them was literally burned. The burning of those ships deserves a moment of reflection. It was meant to prevent the Persians from using them, yes, but it also symbolized something deeper, the point of no return. When you burn your own ships, you're saying there's only one way forward, only one path to take. For Jovian and his legions, that path led through Persian territory with no shortcuts, no easy escapes, no divine interventions waiting around the corner. Night after night, Jovian must have lain awake in his tent, listening to the sounds of camp. Men coughing, groaning from wounds or hunger, whispered conversations about home and families they might never see again. He carried the burden that every leader in an impossible situation carries. Whatever choice he made, people would suffer, fight on, and they might all perish in the desert, negotiate, and Rome's honor would be stained forever. What would you have done? It's easy for us, sitting comfortably 16.5 centuries later, to judge the decisions of desperate men. But Jovian didn't have the luxury of hindsight. He had to decide with incomplete information, under crushing pressure, knowing that thousands of lives hung on his choice. The Persians, of course, knew exactly how desperate the Roman position was. Their king, Shapur II, was no fool. He could afford to wait, to let hunger and heat do most of his work. But he also knew that cornered animals fight fiercest, and a Roman army, even a starving one, was still dangerous. Perhaps a negotiated settlement would serve everyone's interests. And so, as the Roman army limped northward, as men collapsed on the march and were left behind because there was no choice, As the last scraps of food were divided among 80,000 increasingly hopeless soldiers, Jovian came to his decision. He would negotiate. He would ask for terms. He would do the unthinkable. He would save his army by sacrificing Rome's pride. The messengers were sent. The Persian response came back. And what Jovian learned in those negotiations would shock the Roman world and reshape the balance of power in the East for decades to come. The price of survival, it turned out, would be higher than anyone could have imagined. The negotiations began in the worst possible way, with Roman desperation hanging in the air like the dust that clung to every soldier's skin. Jovian knew he had no cards to play, and worse, the Persians knew it too. When you sit down to negotiate from a position of complete weakness, you're not really negotiating at all. You're begging. King Shapur II, the ruler of the Sassanian Persian Empire, had waited his entire life for this moment. He'd been crowned as an infant. Legend says they literally placed the crown on his mother's belly before he was even born, and he'd spent decades fighting Rome to a standstill. Now, finally, a Roman emperor was coming to him, hat in hand, asking for mercy. The terms Shapur demanded weren't just harsh. They were calculated to inflict maximum humiliation, to strip away everything Rome had gained in the East over the past century, and to advertise to the entire ancient world that Roman invincibility was a myth. First came the cities. Nisibis, the very name of the treaty that would be signed, was perhaps the most painful loss. This wasn't just another frontier town. Nisibis had been Roman for over 70 years, a thriving city that sat astride the major trade routes between East and West. It had walls that had withstood 3 Persian sieges. The people who lived there had grown up Roman, paid Roman taxes, worshipped in Roman temples and Christian churches. They thought of themselves as citizens of Rome, and now Jovian was going to hand them over to the Persians like a merchant selling goods at market. But Nisibis wasn't alone. The city of Singara went too, along with not just 5 but 15 fortresses that Rome had painstakingly built and maintained along the Mesopotamian frontier. Think about what that means for a moment. These weren't just military outposts. They were the bones of Rome's defensive network in the East, built over generations, positioned at key river crossings and mountain passes, staffed by soldiers whose families had served in those same forts for decades. Each fortress represented years of Roman engineering, Roman money, Roman blood. Some had been built by emperors whose names were already legendary: Trajan, Hadrian, Septimius Severus. And now, in a single treaty signed in desperation, they were all being given away. The entire defensive infrastructure that had taken a century to construct was being dismantled with the stroke of a pen. But perhaps the most shameful clause of all, the one that would haunt Roman diplomacy for years to come, was what happened to Armenia. Armenia wasn't some distant province or recent conquest. The Armenians had been Rome's allies for generations, a buffer state between Roman and Persian power. Armenian kings had fought alongside Roman legions, had sent their sons to be educated in Rome, had tied their fate to Roman success. The relationship was built on trust, on the promise that Rome would protect its friends. Jovian abandoned them. The treaty specified that Rome would withdraw all support from Armenia, leaving the Armenians to face Persian pressure alone. Imagine being an Armenian diplomat or prince hearing this news. Your ally, the mighty Roman Empire, the power you'd bet everything on, was simply walking away, leaving you to whatever fate the Persians had in mind. It was betrayal on a geopolitical scale, and it sent shockwaves throughout the region. Other kingdoms and peoples who had looked to Rome for protection now had to wonder, if Rome would abandon Armenia, would it abandon us too? Can we really trust the word of an empire that signs away its allies to save itself? The diplomatic damage was incalculable. Rome's reputation as a reliable partner, built up over centuries, took a devastating blow in a single afternoon of negotiation. And then there was the final insult, the 30-year peace. Under normal circumstances, peace is what everyone wants, right? Peace means no war, no death, no destruction. But this peace was different. It was on Persian terms, which meant Rome was acknowledging Persian superiority. It meant that for an entire generation, 30 years, Rome couldn't contest Persian expansion, couldn't support its former allies, couldn't even build new fortifications in the region without Persian permission. 30 years. That's long enough for a child born on the day the treaty was signed to grow up, have children of their own, and watch their children start to come of age, all while living under the shadow of this humiliating agreement. The political and military consequences rippled outward like waves from a stone thrown into a pond. Rome's eastern provinces, which had always been vulnerable but protected by a network of fortresses and allied states, were now exposed. The fortresses were gone. The allies were gone. All that remained was a weakened frontier and the hope that the Persians would honor the 30-year peace. Governors in Syria and Mesopotamia had to completely rethink their defensive strategies. How do you protect provinces when all your forward defenses have been stripped away? How do you defend cities that now sat uncomfortably close to the new Persian border? Soldiers who had served in those abandoned fortresses had to march west, watching the walls they'd defended grow smaller behind them, knowing they'd never return. The treaty also set a terrible precedent. Other emperors, other generals would remember that when Rome was desperate, it could be forced to surrender almost anything. It showed that Roman power had limits, that the eagle could be made to bow. In future negotiations, Persian diplomats would undoubtedly reference the Peace of Nisibis as proof that Rome could be beaten, that its threats were hollow. Perhaps most devastating of all was what this did to Roman morale. Not just military morale, but the psychological confidence of an entire civilization. Romans had grown up believing their empire was eternal, that it would last forever, that no enemy could truly threaten it. They'd been taught that Roman legions were invincible, that Roman diplomacy was supreme, that the gods themselves favored Rome above all nations. The Peace of Nisibis shattered that illusion. It proved that Rome could lose, could be humiliated, could be forced to accept terms it would never have considered in better times. And once that illusion is broken, once people see that their empire is vulnerable, something fundamental changes in the collective consciousness. Confidence becomes caution, certainty becomes doubt. Jovian signed the treaty. He didn't have a choice. Not really. His army was saved. Those 80,000 soldiers got to march home to their families instead of dying in the Persian desert. That alone might justify his decision. How do you weigh the lives of 80,000 men against the pride of an empire or the fate of an allied kingdom? But saving those soldiers came at a price that Rome would pay for decades. The eastern frontier would never be quite as secure. Armenia would eventually fall under Persian domination, just as everyone feared. And future wars between Rome and Persia, and there would be many, would be fought from a weaker position, with Rome always trying to recover what it had lost in 363. When Jovian finally returned to Roman territory, he must have hoped for some recognition that he'd done the best anyone could have done in an impossible situation. Instead, he found anger, disappointment, and blame. People didn't want to hear about impossible situations or necessary sacrifices. They wanted their empire to be strong, to be victorious, to be Roman. And the Peace of Nisibis made Rome look weak. Jovian's reign didn't last long. He died just 8 months after signing the treaty, possibly from natural causes, possibly not. Some historians have wondered if the circumstances of his passing were as innocent as they seemed. An emperor who signs away Roman territory and abandons Roman allies makes enemies after all. But whether his end was natural or otherwise, Jovian's legacy was sealed. He would be remembered as the emperor who humiliated Rome. Yet here's something worth considering, something that often gets lost in the judgment of history. Jovian faced a choice between pride and survival, between the image of Rome and the lives of Romans. He chose survival. He chose to bring 80,000 soldiers home to their families. He chose the practical over the prestigious. And yes, it cost Rome dearly. But those soldiers got to see their homes again, got to hold their children, got to live out their lives in peace. Was it worth it? That's a question without a clear answer, one that each of us has to answer for ourselves. What would you have done in Jovian's place, fought on and risked total destruction, or signed the treaty and lived with the shame? There's no easy answer, and that's what makes this story so endlessly fascinating. It's not about heroes and villains. It's about humans making impossible choices under unbearable pressure and then living with the consequences. The Peace of Nisibis of 363 marked a turning point in Roman history. It showed that even the mightiest empires have their limits, that even Rome could be forced to bend. And it set the stage for centuries more of conflict between Rome and Persia, two superpowers locked in an endless struggle that would only end when both civilizations were eventually swept away by forces neither could have predicted. So here we are, at the end of a story that began with dreams of glory and ended in the dust of compromise. The Peace of Nisibis wasn't just ink on parchment or words spoken between diplomats. It was a moment of reckoning, one of those rare times in history when an empire has to look at itself in the mirror and confront an uncomfortable truth. Rome, the eternal city, the power that had conquered the known world, the civilization that believed its destiny was written in the stars. Rome had been humbled, not destroyed, not conquered, but humbled in a way that perhaps hurt even more, because destruction you can fight back against. Humiliation you have to live with. Think about what this meant for the average Roman citizen back home, hearing the news. Maybe you're a merchant in Rome itself, or a farmer in Gaul, or a soldier stationed on the Germanic frontier. Word reaches you that the emperor signed away cities, abandoned allies, surrendered fortresses that Romans had defended with their lives. How does that feel? Does it change the way you see your empire, your place in the world? And on the other side, imagine being Persian, a subject of King Shapur II. For your entire life, maybe for generations, Rome has been this looming presence, this supposedly invincible force that your empire has fought to a standstill again and again. And now, finally, definitively, Rome has bowed. Rome has admitted it cannot win. That must have felt like vindication, like proof that Persia was every bit Rome's equal, perhaps even its superior. But here's the thing about empires, about power, about the great sweep of history. Nothing lasts forever. Persia stood triumphant in 363, but that triumph was temporary. Within a few centuries, both Rome and Persia would face threats neither could have imagined. New religions, new peoples, new ways of organizing society. The rivalry between these two ancient superpowers would eventually become a footnote, a chapter in history books, a story people like us tell to understand how the world we know came to be. History never forgets, but it also never stops moving. The fortresses Rome surrendered, gone now, ruins buried under centuries of sand and stone. The cities that changed hands, they changed hands many more times after that, conquered and reconquered, until the very names meant something different. Armenia, the ally Rome abandoned, it survived, adapted, found new protectors, and exists today as a nation with its own story to tell. But the human element, that remains constant. The choices people make under pressure, the weight of impossible decisions, the tension between ideals and survival, these things echo across the centuries because we still face them. Maybe not on the scale of empires, but in our own lives. We all encounter moments where we have to choose between what feels right and what feels necessary, which brings us back to Jovian, doesn't it? The man history has judged harshly, the emperor who signed the treaty that saved his army but stained his reputation forever. We've spent all this time with his story, walking alongside him through his nightmare, feeling the weight he carried. And now comes the question that matters most. What do we make of him? Was Jovian a coward, as some Romans surely called him? Did he lack the courage to make the hard choice, to fight on even when the odds were impossible? Should he have chosen glory over survival, the honor of Rome over the lives of 80,000 men who just wanted to go home? Or was he a pragmatist, one of the few leaders in history brave enough to make the unpopular choice? Did he see past the mythology of Roman invincibility to the reality of human limits? Was saving those soldiers, real people with real families, more important than preserving an image, a reputation, a collective delusion about eternal empire? There's no objectively correct answer here, and that's what makes history so endlessly fascinating. You can argue either side. You can say Jovian should have fought on, that Rome's reputation and strategic position were worth the risk. You can also say that every one of those 80,000 soldiers was someone's son, someone's father, someone's brother, and bringing them home was the most moral choice possible. What do you think? Really, genuinely, if you were in Jovian's position with all those lives depending on your decision, what would you have done? Would you have gambled everything on Roman pride? Or would you have signed the treaty? Take a moment and imagine yourself there, feeling the heat, hearing the whispers of starving soldiers, knowing that whatever you decide, people will remember forever. The echoes of that decision, made on a summer day in 363, still reach us today. Not because the specific borders of ancient empires matter to our daily lives, but because the dilemma Jovian faced is timeless. Leaders still have to balance principle against pragmatism. Nations still have to decide when to fight and when to negotiate. And all of us, in our smaller ways, face moments when our ideals clash with reality. That's why we tell these stories. That's why we dig into the past, dust off old treaties, and try to understand what people felt 1,600 years ago, because their struggles illuminate ours. Their choices help us think about our own, and their failures, and yes, their occasional triumphs, remind us that we're all part of something larger than ourselves. This ongoing human story that stretches back to the beginning and forward into an unknown future. The ancient battles between Rome and Persia shaped the world you live in today. The religions that spread along those trade routes, the technologies that were shared and stolen across that frontier, the very idea of East and West as distinct civilizations. All of this has roots in conflicts like the one we've explored today. History isn't dead. It's alive in every border, every cultural assumption, every inherited idea we carry without even realizing it. And that's exactly what we're here to explore together. Here at Legacy of Empires, we believe the past is never truly lost. It lives in these stories, in these forgotten turning points, in the human dramas that played out on history's stage. Every week, we uncover another piece of that vast puzzle, another moment when everything hung in the balance, another choice that echoed down through the centuries. If you've stayed with us this long, if Jovian's story has made you think or feel something, then you're part of this community of people who believe history matters. And we'd love to have you along for the journey. Hit that like button if this story resonated with you. Share it with someone who appreciates a good historical tale told well. And subscribe to Legacy of Empires so you never miss another chapter in humanity's grand saga. Because we're just getting started. There are so many more stories to tell, so many more forgotten heroes and villains, so many more moments when the fate of civilizations balanced on a knife's edge. The past is waiting, full of secrets and surprises, and we're going to explore it together. So tell us in the comments below, was Jovian a coward or a pragmatist? What would you have done in his place? And what other moments in history do you want us to explore? We read every comment, and your suggestions help shape the stories we tell. Remember, the past isn't gone. It's just waiting for someone to listen to its whispers, to understand its lessons, and to carry its wisdom forward. Stand with us as we uncover those secrets, one story at a time. This is Legacy of Empires, where history lives, breathes, and speaks to us across the centuries. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and never forget, we're all part of this ongoing story, this legacy of empires that rises, falls, and rises again.